So what I want to talk about now is the move in my own research from open adoptions in the United States, which built on my experience and then interviewed birth and adoptive mothers, to look at transnational adoptions, in which I was studying adoptive families in Sweden that adopted from India, from Korea, from Colombia, from Chile, and from Ethiopia primarily. These adoptions were basically closed adoptions. In Sweden, families did have records that were made available if they were available. Sometimes these records were not completely accurate. But basically, families were proceeding as though there was not a birth mother. Most families thought of their children as orphans, and this gets back to some of the discussion that was raised earlier when Peter was talking about some of the numbers of orphans from Ethiopia and so forth that come to the United States. But what happened in adoptions, in transnational adoptions in Sweden and the United States, was very similar to the pressures to open adoption in domestic adoptions, which was that adoptees got older, began asking questions about their heritage, and adoptive parents in some cases began wondering also about what were the relevant things about the background of their child that would help them in raising this child. It gets back to the issue that Diana raised at the end of the last session and that the woman here was responding to, having to do with what is the best interest of the child. At the time that I started my open adoption, my assumption was that it was in the best interest of the child to know as much about his or her history as possible, and that if I could establish a relationship with the birth mother, I would facilitate this child's development in some way. But it became complicated because of the expectation that there should only be one family, there should only be one mother, and so when you're trying to, both for me and for my son and for our family, to sort of balance the relationship between two mothers and two families, it's a tricky operation. It requires a lot of operating by the seat of your pants, as we say. There's not a set of rules as to how you do it. And I think similarly in transnational adoptions, the issue of adoptees going back, for example, on roots trips or trying to find out something about the history of their adoption is fairly easy. It's a fairly conventional practice now, where roots trips are organized. People go back, they visit the orphanage where they came from. In some cases, they meet with foster parents. But I think the issue of meeting a birth mother and establishing a relationship with the birth family becomes more complicated, especially if this goes on over a period of time. So what I want to talk about now is the research that I was doing in Sweden. What that research involved was accompanying people in Sweden, the officials of Adoption Center, to visit various orphanages, to talk with child welfare officials, et cetera, to understand what was the basis for establishing an international adoption in Sweden. And then subsequently, I interviewed 24 adoptees, adult adoptees, ranging in ages from about 16 to their early, too fast? I interviewed adult adoptees who were from about 16 years old to about 30 years old. Some of these adoptees I interviewed over a period of 10 to 15 years. So I followed the development of their relationship with the birth country, which I think is a really important issue methodologically. In my own adoption, my son Finn's relationship with his birth family was extreme. He was so excited to visit his birth family, to be with them. You could see in one of those pictures, one of the pictures he looks kind of sad, the other one he's very animated. It was a wonderful thing. And then when he turned 15 or 16, he really didn't want to do that, and that relationship changed. Similarly, in transnational adoptions with adoptees who've gone back to visit their birth families or birth countries, especially when they visited their birth families, that relationship develops over time. So what I want to provide for you is 3 examples from the adoptees that I've interviewed, which illustrate different kinds of closeness in the relationship that develops between the adopted child and the birth family. In all 3 of these cases, the adoptive mother was extremely supportive of having the birth child meet the birth family. But as I have spoken with these adoptees over a period of time, and most recently I spoke to the last example I'm going to talk about, I spoke to her and her family and her children, her birth children. She explained some of the complications that have sort of resulted in terms of her trying to continue this relationship. It's not an easy relationship, but she's quite determined to do it. All right, so my first example comes from a roots trip, and okay. My first example comes from a roots trip I made to Chile with several Swedish adoptive families in 1998, where one of the adoptees on the trip, this woman, whose name is Clara, who was 19 years old at the time, met her birth mother and other members of her extended family. And this is Clara's adoptive mother. She's Swedish. And this is her birth mother, who's Chilean. And it was a much bigger family than you can see here. The husband of the birth mother, the child of the husband of the birth mother and the birth mother, who's a half-sibling to Clara, were there. There's a woman we can't see who had arranged the adoption, who took care of Clara's mother 19 years before when she'd given birth and needed to be taken care of. And this is another picture taken of the whole extended family with Clara, her birth mother, the husband of her birth mother, and and this is the woman who had taken care of Clara and sort of supported her birth mother at the time of the adoption. So after this roots trip, I went back, I was an interpreter on the trip. So in this meeting of Clara and her mother, I was doing my best to interpret from Spanish to Swedish. It turns out that I do fine with Spanish to English and Swedish to English, but Spanish to Swedish turned out to be complicated for me. For some reason, I got things confused. But in any case, I was in the middle of this meeting. It was an incredibly powerful meeting when they first met. The birth mother came out from behind, out of a room in the house of this woman on the side. Clara and her adoptive mother were there. Everybody was in tears, and I was trying to sort of say things that they were whispering to one another. So when I asked Clara a month later, when I interviewed her, because I couldn't do any interviews on the trip, it was too complicated, I said to her how she had felt about this. And she said, "I felt so strange and wondered how I would react. If I would stay in one piece, or if I would immediately begin to cry when she came. But when she saw me, she began to cry, but it was as though, because I have always had a hole inside, or however one might say it, and then when I saw her, immediately I cried, and then the hole was filled again. I still don't understand that feeling, that it went so fast. I was almost a little scared." And when she said I was almost a little scared, it reminded me of an interview I had with another adoptive mother who had a son in a closed domestic adoption, and she asked him whether he did not want her to try to find his birth mother. And he said no, because he felt that the absence of the birth mother was like a part of his body, and if he had to find her, that part of his body would go away and it would be scary. So I think of this business of eliminating the birth mother and displacing one mother with another as a physical experience that makes it very difficult to sort of negotiate that complicated relationship. So Clara's adoptive mother, who I interviewed also at the end of a month later in Sweden, I asked her what it was like, and she said, it was a very strong experience. I had also imagined what she would be like, that she was probably very poor and had lived a hard life and would be marked by that. But that wasn't the way it was. More slowly. Sorry. I'm trying to get all of this talked in and also speak slowly, and it doesn't work to do both, so I'm probably going to have to skip things. It was a very strong experience. I had also imagined what she would be like, that she was probably very poor and had lived a hard life and would be marked by that. But that wasn't the way it was. Well, she was poor, but not very poor. One understood how much she had suffered. Clara added, one thing I had thought a lot about was sitting in the same room with two mothers. I thought it would feel strange. And I said, and when it actually happened? She said, it felt good, partly because I could speak Swedish with my mother from Sweden, who was there, and then I had you, me, who could translate. I felt supported to have Mama, her Swedish Mama, along, someone from Sweden. It was something one could return to, that one wasn't alone in Chile. So I think this gives you some sense of the psychological, emotional dynamics of this relationship. It is not like an aunt. It's definitely very different from just a relative of some kind, or like a stepmother. It's just not like that at all. It's because it's one of the slides, which I guess I can go back and try to find. Yeah, there is a philosopher named Hans Weihinger whose work is really very interesting, and he talks about something that he calls as-if knowledge. So adoption is a kind, balancing an adoptive and a birth relationship involves as-if knowledge, because you're trying to act as if this is the only family when something else is going on. And according to Weihinger, as-if knowledge is knowledge that is neither true, this is really complicated, which is why I have it, neither true nor not true, but is itself the tension between what is true and not true. And what I think is complicated for adoptive and birth mothers is to balance the tension between the fact that neither is a real mother or not a real mother, but together they constitute adoptive motherhood, and that relationship of adoptive motherhood is really very complicated and gives us a model for other ways we can think about motherhood that is not exclusive, that is more inclusive. In this particular case of Clara and her mother, of Clara and her mother, wait. As far as I know, there have not been return visits. I know there were some letters exchanged. Clara got worried when her adoptive mother kept sending letters in Spanish that she could not understand, and then she had to get them translated. And I'm not sure how that is. I think that after the meeting, the mother wanted more contact. Clara went back to Sweden. The hole was filled, and she wasn't sure she needed any more contact with the birth mother. I think people have very different experiences. The second case I want to talk about, how much time do I have? Some minutes? Okay. 10 or something. Okay, the second case I want to talk about is about an American adoptee who is a student of mine from Korea. I use this case as an example because it raises so many complex issues that surround and might possibly romanticize the reunion with the birth mother. In this case, my student was adopted as don't read this thing because this is about something else. In this case, my student was adopted as an 8-year-old by a family in the United States. Her mother was a social worker who had been in charge of receiving this